There's probably some slides. Yes. A bit of housekeeping. There are toilets, but if you need the toilet, don't miss my talk. Just piss against the wall. If there's a fire, don't panic. Make a queue. Give me your large denomination notes. And then just fucking get out of here. Just like, if the person next to you isn't moving fast enough, trample on them. You owe them nothing. Any Italians in? Good. I don't speak Italian, but everywhere I walk in Rome, ladies say ciao bello to me. So I guess that means good morning. Ciao bello, Italians. I'm going to do a tour of the sausage factory. But let's talk about important things. Let's talk about me. I do web standards and open source advising to Wix Engineering. I am a co-editor of HTML5 at W3C. I invented the picture element. I shared a house with Rowan in Turkey. The stories I could tell, ladies and gentlemen. I was a tarot card reader, a musician, a teacher to a crown princess, and a Bollywood extra in India. But I'm probably best known for my fashion blog, What's Bruce Wearing Today? .tumblr.com. The Italians will obviously appreciate my fashion advice. This is Otto von Bismarck. He was the Chancellor of Germany ages ago. And he probably never said this, but it's attributed to him. The less men know of the making of laws and sausages, the better they sleep at night. Sausages are like politicians. They're mostly lips and arseholes. But they are quite disgusting. They're not as disgusting as this. This was my Christmas dinner 8 years ago on the Burmese-Thai border. It's cow placenta soup. It's not as nice as it sounds. I can guarantee that. But of course, sausages and laws or standards, people think that we sit in a room dreaming great thoughts and the standards get made. But my friends, the truth is a lot more nasty than that. It's a tale of blood, sweat, tears, love, sex, agony, hatred, and violence. So if you're a nervous person, go out now. I wanted to get a picture of some sausages as a sausage theme throughout this talk. So I looked on Google for happy sausage. But if you Google happy sausage, it can be a little bit distressing. So I paid my 15-year-old daughter to draw me some slides. So this is a happy sausage, a motif, I think, for web standards. The Economist in '93 said the noisiest of competitive battles will be about standards. In the computer industry, new standards can be the source of enormous wealth. I'm very rich. Or the death of corporate empires. Standards arouse violent passions. I've given you a trigger warning. If you're nervous, leave. This is 1908 in Buffalo, New York. And the manufacturers of piano rolls met to discuss standards. These are piano rolls. It's basically perforated pieces of paper that you could feed into a special piano, and then the piano would play itself according to that paper. It was like a very early MIDI standard. And it was really good because it allowed, for example, Rachmaninoff to play his piano concerto, and then it would be recorded on these piano rolls and distributed around. So if you wanted, you could buy an actual piano roll of Rachmaninoff playing his piano concerto. And every manufacturer of these pianos had a different standard. It was considered a competitive advantage. So if you wanted Rachmaninoff's piano concerto, you could only buy the piano roll from one manufacturer, and you could only play it on that manufacturer's device. But The piano player manufacturers gathered to solve the vexed question of the scale to be used for the 88-note players. At present, 6 and 9 perforations to the inch represent the two extremes. And the Buffalo Gazette tells us in 1908 there were addresses by various representatives who argued that their position is the correct one. And what's interesting to me, having worked in web standards for more than 10 years, I'm actually only 25 and I just look this shit because I work in web standards. Don't do it. It turns you into this. But what's interesting is that 100+ years later, the arguments used then are the same ones we hear argued now. So Mr. Pletcher said that 6 to the inch perforations afford great possibilities, but his company are willing to abide by the sense of the meeting. This is kind of the Firefoxy approach. Mr. Hale spoke at great length, and he produced lots of data. Out of 3,838 compositions, only 1,130 needed only 65 notes, blah, 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 blah. This is the Google position. They bring lots of data to the table. Mr. Voti said that they had invented a new spool that would make proper tracking a simpler proposition, and they will not patent this if everybody else wants to use it. This is kind of a Firefoxy, Opera, maybe even a Microsoft position. Guess who this is? The 9-inch to the scale has been adopted by this company and they're not open to argument. Apple. I don't know how you say this man's name, but I like to call him Mr. Kludge. Mr. Kludge said that he will not budge. Anyway, they eventually agreed 9 perforations for the inch, a standard width of 11¼ inches, leaving a margin each side for future development. And Mr. Dickinson suggested that the piano player and the music roll manufacturers effect a permanent organisation for meeting and discussing these questions. And thus, my friends, modern standards began. But standards have been going forever, since Victorian times. My daughter drew me a Victorian sausage here. She can draw you any kind of sausage you want, just see me afterwards. This is the first railway coach. The first railway coach was pulled by horses. And 60% of the world's railways use a gauge of 1,435 millimeters, 4 for 8½ inches, which is known as the international gauge or the Stevenson gauge. And this works really well. The actual precise width is somewhat arbitrary. As long as every rail and every train use the same width, it works. But when countries border and they have a different gauge, that's a problem. This is an old photograph on the Ukraine-Russian border. There is one, if Mr. Putin is around. And they have a different gauge, so they have to get all the passengers off and they lift up the carriage, put it onto different wheels, and it continues along its way. This takes time, it's inconvenient, and time, as we know, is money. The break of gauge in the US, because the southern states had a different gauge from the northern states, hindered the Confederacy's ability to move goods and the army efficiently over long distances, and arguably it contributed to the Confederacy's defeat in the Civil War. So after the Civil War, they dug up all of the southern states' railways over 2 days and relayed them according to the same gauge as the northern states, and thus we had an American standard. The UK government says, open standards give us interoperable software, information and data in government, and reduces costs by encouraging competition, avoiding lock-in to suppliers or products, and providing more efficient services. Standards are money savers. It's not just nice to have, it's economically useful. You're all clever people. Can anybody tell me what these are? Not you, Rowan? Okay, so you don't know. Well, these are horses' arses. Jot that down, ladies and gentlemen, if you don't recognise a horse's arse. This is 2 horses' arses. And the reason that the international gauge is the width it is because it's the width of 2 horses' arses. And the reason for that is that Romans, there's a Roman sausage, the Romans, who were kind of from around this neck of the woods, the Romans came to the UK to say hello and civilize us. Thanks, Italians. And they had chariots that were pulled by 2 horses. And the width of those chariots made dents in the mud, because we didn't have roads until the Italians came. Thanks, Italians. And so every chariot would go along the same dents in the road, and then people made stagecoaches, and they had machinery that made the stagecoaches that width. And that width is the width of 2 horses' arses. If the railways were being made now, the gauge would be bigger, because a killer disease is quietly spreading through the horse population of the United Kingdom. This disease is obesity. Horses are getting fatter, my friends. Who wants to see a picture of a fat horse? Here's a fat horse. I blame the fast food industry for pushing their hay-pea meals upon the equine population. I've forgotten where I am now. Oh, this is an informal sausage. And some standards are just informally made. Forever, in the HTTP spec, referrer will be spelled incorrectly, simply because the misspelling was a typo in the RFC 1945, and it can never, ever be changed. CSS colors. Anybody heard of CSS? Nice. The first versions of Mosaic and Netscape Navigator use the X11 colors as the basis for the web colors list. And then they got moved into SVG and CSS, so they can never change. But nobody knows who originally compiled the list. I have a theory, and I believe it was compiled by somebody with an unhealthy interest in internet pornography. Because if you look at the color list, any one of these could actually be the name of a porn actor. Alice Blue, Rosie Brown, Burley Wood, Deep Pink, Papaya Whip. Would anybody like to guess which of these is a porn actor? Not you, Rowan. These are all CSS colors. Put your hand up when you spot the porn actor. Ooh. Hot pink, violet blue, misty rose, lavender blush, peach puff, goldenrod. The porn actor is violet blue. The CSS color is blue violet. Violet blue is a porn actress who specializes in oral sex and wrote books about it. There was a porn actress called Blue Violet, Violet Blue, but she got sued by the other Violet Blue, whose real name is Ada Mae Edmondson, and now Violet Blue performs under the name No Name Jane. So if nothing else, ladies and gentlemen, you've learnt something today. I want to thank Rowan for that information. Other standards travel through time. This is Doctor Who sausage. These things have been in browsers since about IE5, XML HTTP requests, content editable, Quirks mode, and Canvas was invented by Apple, and they were standardized much later. In fact, XML HTTP request didn't get standardized until 2 years ago, even though it was in IE 5.5. A friend of mine called Anna van Kesteren, who looks worse than I do, standardized it. Canvas in the HTML5 spec is a special thanks to Richard Williamson for creating the first implementation of Canvas in Safari, from which the Canvas feature was designed. A guy called Ian Hickson, who used to work for Opera and now he works for Google, and is the editor of the HTML spec. he had to reverse engineer how Apple made Canvas. And that basically means throwing all kinds of crazy numbers at it, working out what happens, and then documenting it. And then the other browsers would do the same, and we all tried to reverse engineer it, and actually we were lucky because we didn't introduce bugs. So he wrote it all down, and by the time Microsoft wanted to implement Canvas, they didn't have to do thousands of man-hours of reverse engineering. They just read the spec and implemented it, and we're all happy. It's not hard to get your name in the HTML5 spec. Any loser can do it. So, but the path to standardization wasn't smooth. It was a lack of a proper proposal from Apple, and the initial spec was based upon reverse engineering by Hixie. And this is patents. When I worked for Opera, I was not even allowed to use the word patents. And the reason is that in the USA, God bless them, anybody from the US here? Yes. Where are you from? California. I'm sorry? California. No, I heard. I'm sorry. So, a cheap joke, and I love California. Thank you. In the US, if you infringe a patent, you can be, you have to pay a certain amount in damages. But if it can be showed that you knowingly infringed a payment, you have to pay 3 times that sum. And therefore, those of us who work in browsers, you cannot even discuss the word patent over anything email related, because that can be used later to show that you knew there was a patent, and then you pay 3 times the amount of billions of dollars. So I said to Hixie, what's the biggest danger to a free open web at the moment? And he said, patents. And I said to my daughter, can you draw me a picture of a big letter P that's evil, murdering a sausage? And she went, yeah, no problem, Dad. There we go. It all came to a head when some Apple lawyer wrote to the HTML5 specification body and said, "Dear Mr. Hickson," and nobody calls Hixie Mr. Hickson. Apple Computer Inc., Apple, believe its intellectual property rights, IP rights, relative to the application WG 1.0 draft entitled Canvas, the Bitmap Graphics, the Bitmap Canvas, they said, we own this, and you cannot use it unless you take this spec to the W3C, because the W3C has a patent policy. And it went there, and everybody loved it, and it was great. But it was originally implemented in Safari as an empty tag, like image. But Opera and Mozilla, when we reverse engineered it, we gave it a closing tag. And when you have an opening tag and a closing tag, you can put stuff in the middle for fallback, which is a good thing. So for example, when a canvas element represents embedded content, the user can focus on descendants of the canvas element, the stuff in the middle, even though you can't see it. If somebody doesn't have graphics enabled or they're using a screen reader, they can focus into it and use stuff in the middle. This allows authors to make an interactive canvas keyboard accessible, which is a good thing. Who loves accessibility? Who hates accessibility? So, yeah, anyway. So when we made the video element, we had stuff in the middle. And if a browser knows about the video element, it ignores the stuff in the middle. And if a browser doesn't know about the video element, and there are plenty of them still that do not know, because not everybody can upgrade their browsers, then they will see this stuff in the middle. And this is markup. There's an image, there's a paragraph, you can style this. If it's all in attributes like image alt equals, you can't style it. It just shows the tooltip, which is crap. So when we invented the picture element, when I invented the picture element, me, I had a slight hangover when I invented that as well, not just today. When we invented the picture element, we did the same thing. We had markup in the middle rather than just attributes. The W3C in XHTML2, it tried to do the same. It tried to implement a closing tab for image so you could have stuff in the middle. But the trouble is, in any browser you try this in, you'll see that image and then you will see that text because this is not backwards compatible. And XHTML2 was a huge mistake and it got retired in 2009. The participants of the working group were only told over email by Tim Berners-Lee, which was a bit rubbish. And this is an example of a formal standard. XHTML2 was the next great thing. The W3C sat down and said, how should HTML really be if it was pure and lovely and properly thought out? And so they worked on this spec for ages. And it was a beautiful specification of philosophical purity that had no resemblance to the real world. I remembered this quote and I Googled for it to find out who said it, and it was me, and I'd forgotten about it. To some journalist, I was hungover. Now, Timbo, or Sir Tim Berners-Lee to you, but Timbo to me, he said, we made a mistake, we couldn't move everybody to XML. The large HTML generating public, that's you, did not move, largely because the browsers didn't complain. And that was a little bit disingenuous. Translators get that? Disingenuoso, probably. That was a bit disingenuous because the browsers did not complain, because the XML spec said, if there is one validation error, you must stop rendering. Imagine that. Now, everybody in this room, I can see just by looking at you, always writes perfectly formed HTML off the bat, right? But you all have like loser colleagues or idiot friends who make validation areas, right? Yeah. Rowan. But imagine that. Imagine if one unencoded ampersand or one slight mistake in the markup that you pull in because it's adverts or a template's buggered up somehow, that would actually prevent the page from displaying by specification. That would be nonsense. And so we browsers went, fuck that. That's what we said. We went, no. So Timbo was right, the browser didn't complain, but not because we want to get in the way of development of specifications, but because browsers serve the people who are browsing. And this made no sense at all. HTML5 parsing algorithm. Hands up who can recite it. I can't either. It's like a ninja of standards. Nobody notices it, but it's incredibly powerful. HTML4 told the browsers what to do with good markup, but it said nothing at all about what to do with bad markup. So in the old days, if you had a B and then an I, and you closed the B before you closed the I, so they were overlapping, the browsers would do different things with that. And they were perfectly entitled to, because the spec said nothing at all about what to do in such a case. And that was a problem because 97% of the web does not validate, but the browsers were making different DOMs, which made it very, very difficult for those of you who write JavaScript to parse that DOM. And that was the biggest cause of lack of interoperability. So the HTML5 spec specifies in minute detail what to do with every conceivable, possible bad markup combination. Any kind of unclosed or missing tags, it will always produce the same DOM. But it's not trying to support old browsers, it's trying to support old content. Because the web is 25 years old, and there are websites out there that exist when the owner or the maintainer has moved on or died. And nobody will ever change those. But it is vital to our digital heritage, that those still be renderable by browsers. Bacon. Anybody read Charlotte's Web? Cool, then you'll recognize this guy. This guy's called Wilbur. And Wilbur was the nickname for the HTML 3.2 spec. Relative to HTML2, HTML 3.2 adds widely deployed features such as tables, applets, text flow around images, superscripts, and subscripts. HTML 3.2 basically retrospectively standardized things that Netscape and Microsoft had built into their browsers and developers were using, and it went back and standardized them. It was basically like HTML5, but 10 years before. Now, if you're me and a nerd, you read about HTML 3.2 superseding HTML2, and you think, what happened to HTML3? The mystery of the missing specification, ladies and gentlemen. HTML3 was a proposal for extending HTML published in '95, but the difference between 2 and 3 was so large that we couldn't standardize it and we couldn't deploy it. So the HTML3 draft has expired and is not being maintained, and it's really hard to find. But I spent a day digging through old mailing lists and found a zip file of it. And HTML3 had new form fields, checkboxes, range controls, sliders or knobs. We had to wait 10 years for this. Single multiple choice menus and Scribble on image. And I thought, what is Scribble on image? So I had a look. Scribble on image, these fields allow the user to scribble with a pointing device on top of a predefined image. If the user agent can't display images or you can't have a pen, then it should be treated as a text field. What? Just think how much brilliant our lives would be if we had Scribble on image now. Yeah, I mean, who on earth would ever want this? But it's interesting because they had fallback, even though this never made it into the spec. They also invented this, a figure. Figure, and there's the source, and then you have a caption inside it, and a credit. And this is a great idea, except that it's not backwards compatible. If this had made it into the browsers, any old browser, and all of them would have been old browsers when this hit the streets, would ignore this because HTML, if it doesn't know what the element is, by default, it ignores it. And so that wouldn't show, the image wouldn't show, the caption would show, the credit would show, but browsers wouldn't know what to do with it. This was not backwards compatible. If this had come into the standards, every browser would just show text and not show this image. Caption doesn't work. We tried to add this into HTML5, and if you have a caption outside a table, it just makes the DOM go, bleh. Nobody knows why. It's just a thing in IE6. But it produced an unpredictable DOM. So that's why we don't have a caption element in HTML5. Instead, we have a figure element. And we have an image inside that, and we redefine small to mean small print, credits, and attributions. But any browser that doesn't understand figure will ignore that, but it will show this image, so it is backwards compatible. It will show this small text, and it's good to go. It's backwards compatible. It doesn't break the web. If you're going to pave a cow path, pave the damn cow path. Don't invent a new one. So HTML 3.2, it deployed rendering attributes such as script and style. I believe that JavaScript and CSS are quite popular in the web development world. HTML3 was a shunned sausage. Nobody wanted to know about it. And this still happens today. If HTML5 had a party, this would be WebSockets, and this would be video, but the API is sitting by itself, getting sadly drunk on cheap cider, no offense, Rowan, and not snogging anybody. That would be the app cache API. An app cache As Alex Russell, a sinister mastermind at Google, said, app cache is declarative. You give the browser a manifest and magic happens. This has well-documented limitations. This was a way for browsers and web pages to work even when offline. Morning, you've missed all the good bits, but glad you could join us. It was slapdash. Hicksey said, the app cache API is a big mistake. It's the best example of not understanding the problem before designing a solution. The people who make HTML5 are brilliant spec writers, but they are not web developers. So app cache solves a problem brilliantly. The trouble is, it solves the wrong problem. They didn't consult web developers before they invented it. And because it's all declarative and magic, you cannot change it. You cannot control it. Application cache is a douchebag, said Jake Archibald. I got into trouble in the US for saying the word douchebag, even though apparently this is only a thing in the US. Can the lights go down? Can you just turn the lights down a little bit? I'd like you all to look at this picture. Look very carefully at this picture. I do not need to have this picture on the screen now, but I'm just leaving it there to punish you for drinking too much red wine last night. But look at this cat. Look into its eyes. Look deeply into its eyes. Listen to my voice. Give me your money. And wake up. So, to replace app cache, we, the community, invented service workers. And I like service workers so much that I've employed my Photoshop skills to make this logo for it. Look at the cat, look into the cat's eyes, listen to my voice, give me your money. Service workers are absolutely great. It is just JavaScript. There's no magic. Everything is controllable by you. You have to write the script, but you can do anything you want. It forces you to have URLs. Apps can be offline by default. Normal loading is the fallback behavior. They are great. I cannot have enough time today to explain service workers, so we're going to use an analogy. This Luna module represents your web app. This walrus with a fish represents your user, and the fish is obviously the task that the user wants to complete. And this leg lampshade represents the network. And we all know that you can't get a walrus into a Luna. This is a shit analogy, so here's some code. Okay, so the code, this is how you register a service worker. Very simple. You navigate to serviceworker.register, bring it in, worker.js, it's just JavaScript. Reload if it's successful, otherwise say it's failed and your website will not work offline, but it will still work online just like any website. So pre-service workers, if your browser was not connected to the internet, which is a series of tubes, as we know, then you just got a boring browser message saying sorry. But with service worker, look at the cat, look into its eyes. With service worker, if you're not connected, you can still talk to a database where maybe you've stored other information that you dragged down when the website was online, and you can say nice things to your users. You can do whatever you want. Maybe when the user first goes to the website, you download the almost 20 popular products, and then later on they come, they're not connected, and you say, hey, you're not online, but here's 20 products, choose one, and when you come back online, we will automatically sync up. You can do what you want, it's up to you. It gives you the power. There's no magic, but it gives you control and your web developers, so that's the right thing to do. If you want to, you can add a service worker that on Thursday, any image is always a kitten, regardless of what you want. You can do anything you want. And this is an example of extending the web. It is an extendable sausage. And also, do not Google extendable sausage or it's image search. It's really distressing. But this is the way forward. Rather than writing high-level APIs that do lots of magic stuff, We, the standards community, realized the best thing to do is extend the capabilities using JavaScript, giving you low-level primitives that you can combine to do what you want to do. So you don't need to have app cache, which does magic. We give you service worker, and you do what you want with it. We're just exposing low-level primitives. And this is the Extensible Web Manifesto. Browser vendors shall provide low-level capabilities that expose the possibilities of the underlying platform as closely as possible, and then seed discussion of high-level APIs, libraries using JavaScript. Examples of things like web workers, service workers, index database. These APIs are actually quite nasty. They're low-level, and they require lots of cunning work, but people write libraries on top of them, much like jQuery, etc., that you can use. And then when we see those, and we see what the community is doing, then we standardize them. So for example, everybody loved jQuery because it allowed you to target DOM nodes using CSS selectors. It was brilliant. The community loved it. And so we retrospectively standardized that with document.query selector, which does the same thing but baked into browsers. We saw what you loved, we saw what you did, we saw what actually worked, and then we standardized it. So people ask me, why are standards so slow? Again, shout out to my daughter. Can you draw me a picture of a sausage on a snail? Yeah, no problem. Does anybody like me keep snails as pets? I have a pet snail. It's a bit sad, actually. He's having a bit of an existential crisis. He's very embarrassed about the slimy trail he leaves. And to be honest, I can see where he's coming from. Thank you. I had a snail, actually, and I took his shell off to make him more aerodynamic, and it just made him more sluggish. So thank you, why are standards so slow? Mark Roberts, who's a random, emailed the working group and said, why is everything around us developing so fast, but the web is so slow to adopt anything? And Hicksy said, on the web, you have someone design a feature, someone specs it, some people write tests for it, a browser implements it, another browser implements it, another browser implements it, another browser implements it, and then people document it, because it's an open standard. Everywhere else, all it needs is someone to implement it. So we've all seen, Microsoft and Apple and various browsers just implementing stuff because they can. But it's great to have open standards, and we've done this. So 5-6 years ago, if you wanted to access the GPS device on your phone, you had to use a native app, because although every phone had a GPS chip, there was no API for browsers to talk to it. So we invented geolocation. And then we invented the file API and the orientation API and sensors for humidity and ambient light and WebRTC, so that the website with JavaScript can access your camera and your microphone with your permission, obviously. Drag and drop. We standardized all these things that people had made, and then we retrospectively standardized them. Not every proprietary API needs standardization. For example, I see no movement in the W3C for standardizing HK body temperature sensor location rectum, which is from Apple, but maybe we will. If you're interested in this becoming an open standard, see me afterwards and I'll see what I can do. I will bend over backwards to make this work for you. But it's vital that standards be open and not tied to one company, because companies go bust. According to the American Enterprise Institute, some crazy bunch of capitalists, 88% of the Fortune 500 companies from 1955 have gone bankrupt, merged, or still exist, but have fallen out of the big league. Regardless of what you think about Microsoft, Adobe, IBM, Apple, etc., whether you love them or hate them, the web is too important to business and to society to be in the hands of one company. In order for the open web to compete with walled garden competitors, there must be a clear path for good ideas by web developers to become part of the infrastructure of the web. We must enable web developers to build the future web. We don't want to repeat the mistakes of app cache. It took 2 years to write the spec, 2 years to get it implemented, and everybody went, whatever, because it wasn't what developers needed. We don't want to waste time and waste energy like that again. So the most virtuous standards of all come from people in the industry who actually make the web, and that, my friends, is you. So, how can you participate? It's very easy. You go to the Web Incubator community group. It's not a mailing list, it's a website where a group of us from all the browsers and those of us interested in standards lurk and tell us your ideas. Tell us what you want, what you really, really want, said the Spice Girls, and they are my mentors, if you like, for web standardization. Use cases are good. Your pet syntax is not good. Because tell us what you want to do, and enough people will tell us similar but different problems, and we will write low-level APIs that enable this. We will do this, but you have to tell us what you need, because we don't necessarily know. Web standards need you, ladies and gentlemen. Go out there and build the open web. Have a great conference. Bye-bye.